The flickering candlelight cast a warm glow over the dark mahogany table, the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation filling the air. Jake was in his element, his deep, assured voice carrying over the dinner guests as he recounted his latest real estate deal. And the timing was perfect, he said, swirling the aged bourbon in his crystal glass. You have to know when to strike in this business. When everyone else hesitates, that's when I move. That's what separates the winners from the ones just playing the game. The table murmured their approval, nodding along like an obedient chorus, hanging on to his every word. To them, Jake was a visionary, a man who made things happen. A closer. I forced a polite smile, lifting my wine glass to my lips, hiding the heat rising in my chest. It wasn't the first time I had watched him take credit for our success, for my ideas. But tonight, something about it made my stomach turn. Because I knew the truth. The down payments? My money. The investment strategies? My research. The network of connections? Built through my relationships. Jake had never been more than a well-dressed, well-spoken salesman. He could charm anyone into believing he was a mastermind. And maybe at one point I had let myself believe in him, too. But that belief had faded long ago. Across the table, Brian, the man who had been our attorney for nearly a decade, sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of his tumbler. He had barely touched his drink, barely spoken a word all night. And most of all, he had barely looked at me. Brian was an expert at reading rooms, at navigating corporate negotiations and legal battles. But tonight, he looked like a man struggling with something big. Something he didn't want to say in front of Jake. I caught his gaze across the table and raised an eyebrow slightly. What is it? He looked away, shifting in his seat. That was when I knew. Something was wrong. To Jake. One of the guests, a fellow investor, lifted his glass in a toast. For knowing when to strike and coming out on top. A chorus of agreement followed, glasses clinking, laughter rippling through the room. Jake grinned, basking in the attention. I took another sip of my wine, the rich, velvety red suddenly tasting bitter. The party ended late, the last of the guests trickling out, their laughter and expensive colognes lingering in the air. Jake had been in a good mood all evening, playing the gracious host, shaking hands, offering parting words of wisdom like he was some kind of business guru. That went well, he said, rolling his shoulders as he loosened his tie. We should do these more often. Keeps people invested in our success. Our success. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched as he poured himself another bourbon, heading toward his office, already moving on from the evening. He didn't notice the way Brian lingered in the entryway, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Jake didn't suspect a thing. And why would he? In his mind, I was the same wife I had always been, the silent, supportive partner. But Brian knew better. He waited until he heard Jake's office door close before turning to me. We need to talk, he said quietly. In private. My pulse quickened. I gestured for him to follow me into the sitting room, where the fireplace still crackled softly. The scent of expensive wine and the remnants of dinner hung in the air, but suddenly, the space felt different. Heavier. Brian sat across from me, elbows on his knees, exhaling slowly. He still hadn't touched his drink. I watched him carefully. Whatever this is, I said, keeping my voice even, just say it. He hesitated. Then, finally, he pulled a folder from inside his suit jacket and laid it on the coffee table between us. The cover was thick, the kind of legal file that spoke of precision and intent. I stared at it. You need to prepare yourself, he said. Something cold wrapped around my spine. I reached forward, flipping open the folder. And then my entire world shifted. Page after page of legal documents. Property transfers. Bank account adjustments. Investment portfolio revisions. And my name was nowhere on them. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Brian, I said slowly, my throat tightening, what the hell is this? He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. It's what Jake has been doing for the past 8 months, he said. He's been systematically transferring everything into his name. The properties, the accounts, the investments, everything you two built together. He's making sure you don't own a dime of it. My ears started ringing. I scanned the documents, flipping through them faster, my breath quickening with every page. This wasn't just sneaky financial maneuvering. This was premeditated theft. But that's not possible, I murmured. We structured everything as joint ownership. You handled the paperwork. And he had me revise them. My head snapped up. Brian's face was tight, guilt shadowing his features. He came to me months ago, he admitted. He said he wanted to simplify your finances, make everything more streamlined. He fed me just enough plausible reasoning that I didn't question it, until I did. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Lauren, he's been planning this for almost a year. And it's not just financial. He's already filed for divorce. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from beneath me. Divorce. Not a conversation. Not a discussion. A decision. Already made. Already in motion. Jake had planned to gut me financially and then discard me like an afterthought. I inhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the file so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just betrayal. It was warfare. And Jake thought he had already won. I looked up at Brian, something cold and razor-sharp settling inside me. How much time do I have? I asked. He hesitated. Not much, he admitted. Maybe a few weeks before the legal proceedings kick in. He's assuming you won't see it coming. A slow, bitter smile curled at the edges of my lips. Then he's underestimated me. And that would be his biggest mistake. I sat in the dimly lit sitting room, the flickering fire casting long shadows against the walls. The file Brian had given me lay open on the coffee table, its pages spread out like a crime scene. Because that's exactly what this was, a crime. Jake had been planning my financial execution for nearly a year, slowly and methodically cutting me out of everything we had built together. He hadn't just taken my name off our properties and accounts, he had rewritten history, erasing me from our success as if I had never been part of it at all. And the worst part? I had seen the signs. The late-night meetings he claimed were last-minute investor calls. The way he had insisted on handling more of our financial paperwork himself. The sudden push to update our estate planning, ensuring that things would be easier in case something happened to him. I had dismissed them as quirks, as the habits of a man obsessed with control. I had been so wrong. Across from me, Brian ran a hand over his face, the firelight making the creases in his forehead look deeper. He wasn't just my attorney, he had been a friend, someone who had been with us from the beginning. And now, he was the one breaking the news that my husband had spent the last 8 months turning me into a financial ghost. I should have caught it sooner, he said, shaking his head. But he was smart. Every change was done in increments, always with some kind of justification. It wasn't until I saw the divorce filing that I realized what was really happening. The words divorce filing sent another sharp wave of disbelief through me. Jake already filed? I asked, my voice eerily calm. Brian hesitated. Not officially. But he's met with his lawyers multiple times. The paperwork is drafted. He's waiting for the right moment. The right moment. Like he was playing a game. Like this was just another deal he was closing, another asset he was stripping down for profit. I let out a breath, forcing myself to think, to compartmentalize the panic clawing at my throat. Brian, I said, staring at the documents again. If everything is in his name, if he's already filed to cut me out, what's his plan? He can't think I'm just going to sit back and let him take everything. Brian exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. I think he's banking on you being blindsided. He's positioning himself as the sole financial mind in the marriage, the one who handled all the major decisions. He'll paint you as the wife who was comfortable, uninvolved. My stomach turned. Jake had never respected me. Not really. But this? He was trying to rewrite our history. To make me seem like nothing more than a well-kept spouse, someone who had coasted off his brilliance, someone who had no claim to the wealth we had built together. I clenched my fists. No. I had worked too hard. I had been the one running the numbers, identifying the investment opportunities, structuring the deals. He had been the face, but I had been the foundation. And he thought I wouldn't fight? He thought I would just walk away, humiliated, defeated? I looked up at Brian. He's underestimating me, I said, my voice steady now. Brian met my gaze. Then what's your move? I stared down at the documents again, my mind already spinning with possibilities. Jake had spent nearly a year stripping me of power. But what he didn't know was that I had seen this coming before he even realized he was playing a game. He thought he had been in control. But he had no idea that I had already taken my first step months ago. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Then I dialed. A sleepy voice answered on the second ring. Lauren. I smiled. Hey, David, I said. I need you to run a few reports for me. David Foster was a forensic accountant. And, more importantly, he was loyal to me. Jake thought he had covered his tracks. But he had no idea that I had been watching. And now? Now it was time to see just how deep his betrayal ran. I barely slept that night. Instead, I sat in my home office, surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and printouts of transactions that I no longer had access to, at least, not officially. The weight of what Jake had done pressed against my chest like a cinder block, but the fear that had initially gripped me was already beginning to morph into something else. Strategy. Jake thought I was blindsided. He thought he had maneuvered me into a corner, that I would cry, beg, react. He didn't realize that I was done reacting. I was planning. At 5 a.m., my laptop pinged. A new message from David Foster. David, pulled the reports you asked for. You're going to want to see this. I clicked the file attachment, my eyes scanning the spreadsheet that popped up on my screen. Jake had been sloppy. He had spent months shifting assets, rerouting funds, covering his tracks, but he had underestimated how much I already knew about our financial structure. And more importantly, he had underestimated me. Because while he was busy planning my financial execution, I had already started preparing for war. Nearly a year ago, I had noticed small inconsistencies in our joint financial accounts, minor transfers here and there, investments being shifted without my approval. At first, I had assumed it was just Jake making adjustments on the fly, as he often did. But something about it hadn't felt right. So I had started moving assets of my own. I had created Nova Capital, a holding company in my name only, one that Jake knew nothing about. I had quietly begged and transferring properties, investments, and liquid assets under Nova Capital's control, ensuring that if anything ever went wrong, I would still have leverage. At first, it had just been an insurance policy, a safety net. Now, it was my secret P*N. I took a slow breath, scrolling through the files David had sent me. Jake had no idea that half of the assets he thought he had secured under his name were already legally protected under mine. He had taken his time, meticulously transferring properties and accounts, convinced he was playing the long game. But what he didn't know was that I had already beaten him to it. And the best part? His precious car, the sleek, jet-black Aston Martin DB11 he worshipped more than anything, was registered under Nova Capital. Which meant it belonged to me. I smiled to myself, the first real smile I had managed since Brian handed me that folder. Jake thought he was the mastermind. But he was just another arrogant man who had mistaken my silence for submission. And that mistake was about to cost him everything. At 7 a.m., I made my next move. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. Lauren. Hey, Ashley, I said smoothly. I think it's time we had that meeting. There was a pause, followed by a slow chuckle. I was wondering when I'd hear from you, she said. You finally ready to play? Ashley Chong was one of the most ruthless financial analysts in Chicago. She had made a name for herself by dismantling corrupt corporations and men who thought they were untouchable. And she owed me a favor. I don't just want to play, I said. I want to win. I could hear the amusement in her voice. Now that's what I like to hear. Tell me everything. And so I did. By the time I was finished, Ashley let out a low whistle. Well, she said, your husband's an idiot. Tell me something I don't know. What's your endgame? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. I want him to think he's won, I said. I want him to believe he's got the upper hand. And then, when he least expects it. I let the sentence trail off, letting the possibilities hang between us. Ashley laughed. You always did know how to make things interesting. Send me the files. I'll run the numbers and see just how deep this goes. I sent the documents within seconds. Jake had started a war. He just didn't realize I had already built the battlefield. And now? Now it was time for checkmate. Jake had always prided himself on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He loved the game, the thrill of power plays, the rush of knowing he had outmaneuvered his competition before they even realized they were in a fight. But what he had never understood, what had always been his greatest weakness, was that he assumed I wasn't a player at all. He had mistaken my patience for passivity. He had mistaken my trust for ignorance. And now, he was about to pay the price for those mistakes. I spent the next 48 hours gathering everything I needed. With Ashley running financial forensics and David combing through Jake's transaction history, I had all the ammunition required to dismantle him from every angle. But I wasn't just going to strip him of his assets. I was going to humiliate him. Jake thrived on perception. His entire world was built on the illusion of dominance, on making people believe he was the smartest man in the room. If I had simply fought for my share and walked away, he would have spun the narrative to his advantage. No, that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure that when I took him down, there would be no coming back. By the 3rd day, everything was in place. The first domino to fall? The banks. Using the files David had compiled, I initiated an official inquiry into Jake's financial activity. The patterns of transfers, the sudden shifts of funds, the shell companies he had created to funnel money away from our accounts, it all raised too many red flags. Banks hated financial irregularities. Even the suggestion of fraud was enough to trigger a review. And a review meant freezing assets. Jake was about to wake up to a very unpleasant surprise when he tried to access his accounts. The next strike came in the form of a quiet conversation with an IRS agent. Thanks to Ashley's deep dive, we discovered something Jake had never expected anyone to find: undeclared income. Real estate deals he had structured to skim profits under the table. Partnerships where he had forgotten to report certain earnings. Tax filings that suddenly looked very interesting when examined under a magnifying glass. Jake thought he was slick. He thought he had been careful. But he had been playing a game of inches, and I had measured down to the millimeter. With the financial damage set in motion, I moved on to his business reputation. Jake was in the final stages of securing his most ambitious project yet, a commercial high-rise in downtown Chicago. He had investors lined up, bank approvals pending, and a signing date set for next week. He had spent months selling himself as the key player, the mastermind behind the entire deal. He had no idea that, 3 days ago, I had already bought the property out from under him. Through Nova Capital. I scheduled a private meeting with the property owner, showing them a better offer, one with stronger financial backing, no legal complications, and a proven track record. It hadn't even been a difficult decision for them. By the time Jake arrived at the scheduled signing, ready to gloat about his latest triumph, he would be met with a very different reality. The property wasn't his. The investors were pulling out. And his reputation as a dealmaker? Shattered. The final blow was personal. Jake thought he was playing me. He thought I was still in the dark, waiting to be blindsided by his divorce filing. So I let him believe that. I continued acting the part of the unsuspecting wife, even encouraging him to take time for himself, knowing exactly where he would go. Straight to her. Melissa. His side piece. She was younger. Prettier in a fake, Instagram-filtered way. She thought she was replacing me. She had no idea she was just his next victim. And she definitely had no idea that she had already been replaced. I had made sure of that. Because while Jake was busy securing his next distraction, I was busy securing evidence. Photographs, videos, text messages. All of it tied up neatly in a digital package, waiting for the perfect moment. I knew exactly where to send them. To his investors. To his business partners. To his mother. Jake was about to learn that when I played the game, I played to win. On the 4th day, everything was set in motion. The bank freezes had gone into effect. His accounts locked. The IRS inquiry had been formally initiated. The property deal gone. His investors walking away. And the affair? Exposed. All that was left was for him to realize it. And that moment? That was going to be my favorite part. Jake had no idea his world was already crumbling. He strutted into the Bellamy Hotel's executive lounge, his usual smirk in place, his confidence unwavering. This was where the final paperwork for his crown jewel, the downtown Chicago high-rise, would be signed. He thought today was his victory lap. I was about to turn it into his funeral. I arrived before him, dressed in a sharp, navy blue pantsuit, my heels clicking against the marble floors with purpose. The property owner, Henry Whitmore, sat across from me, sipping his espresso, already reviewing the finalized contract from Nova Capital. "Impressive proposal, Lauren," he said, signing the final page with a flourish. "I have to admit, I was ready to go with Jake until your offer came in." I smiled. "I believe in smart investments, Henry. And smart investments require stable partners." He chuckled. "That's one way to put it." The way his finances are suddenly looking, I'd say I dodged a bullet. He slid the contract across the table. Done. Sealed. Executed. Jake was finished. I leaned back in my chair just as the elevator door slid open. Jake walked in, his navy suit crisp, his Rolex glinting under the recessed lighting. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The moment he spotted Henry, his grin widened. "Henry, my man," Jake said, striding toward the table, extending his hand. "Let's make this official." Henry didn't shake his hand. Jake faltered, his brows furrowing slightly. His eyes flickered toward me for the first time, and I saw the first hint of uncertainty in them. "What is she doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp. I lifted my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down deliberately. "Waiting for you," I said smoothly. Jake's eyes snapped back to Henry. "What's going on?" he demanded. Henry sighed, setting his pen down. "Jake, there's no easy way to say this. I've accepted another offer." Silence. A slow, dangerous silence. Jake's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "What the hell are you talking about?" he said, his voice lower now, controlled but seething. Henry glanced at me. Lauren's firm, Nova Capital, made a stronger offer, one with better backing and fewer complications. Jake's jaw clenched. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the struggle to process what was happening. "You sold the property," he said, his voice flat. Henry nodded. To her. Another nod. Jake turned to me, his expression shifting from disbelief to pure, unfiltered rage. "You bitch," he spat. Henry stiffened. I only smiled. Now, Jake. That's not very professional, is it? "You can't do this," he snapped. "That deal was mine." I shrugged. "Correction. It was yours. Until you made too many enemies." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, still trying to grasp the reality. "You don't have the capital for this," he said, his voice desperate now. "You can't outbid me. You don't have the connections." I tilted my head. "Are you sure?" He stopped. I could see the exact moment realization hit him. The funds he thought he had? Frozen. The investors he thought were backing him? Gone. The reputation he thought was untouchable? Destroyed. His breath came faster now. "You set me up," he whispered. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice calm. "No, Jake," I said. "You set yourself up. I just made sure you got exactly what you deserved." His nostrils flared. "This isn't over." I smiled, picked up the signed contract, and tapped it against the table. "Oh, but it is," I said, rising to my feet. "Enjoy explaining this to your investors." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, defeated. The first of many losses to come. Jake didn't leave the Bellamy Hotel right away. I knew because I had someone watching. Ashley had a contact, one of the hotel's concierge managers, who kept me updated in real time. According to her, after I walked out, Jake just stood there for a full 5 minutes, gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, without another word, he stormed out of the lounge, straight to the rooftop bar, where he downed 3 bourbons in rapid succession. I smiled when I got the text. Let him drink. He was going to need it. The first call came in while he was still at the bar. His main investor, Paul Sheridan, was pulling out. Paul had been funding Jake's real estate ventures for the past 3 years, and up until yesterday, he had been willing to back Jake on this deal. That was before he received a carefully worded anonymous tip about financial irregularities in Jake's portfolio. Before he saw documents detailing how Jake had been quietly funneling money into offshore accounts. Before he was alerted to the sudden IRS interest in Jake's taxes. Jake didn't know it yet, but Paul had already instructed his legal team to sever all ties. No money. No backing. Just like that, one of Jake's biggest financial lifelines was gone. The second call came 20 minutes later. This time, it was his private banker from Forrester and Lane. Jake had been using the firm for years, confident in their discretion, their ability to make certain problems disappear. But banks had rules. And those rules didn't take kindly to sudden asset freezes, fraud concerns, and the mention of an IRS inquiry. "Sir, we're unable to process your withdrawal request at this time," the banker said, his voice smooth but firm. "Due to an internal review, your accounts are temporarily restricted." Jake's temper snapped. "You're telling me I don't have access to my own damn money?" A pause. "That is correct, Mr. Bennett." His heart pounded. "You can't do this. I have a 7-figure balance in that account." "I understand, sir. Unfortunately, until the review is complete, those funds are unavailable." Jake nearly threw his phone across the bar. Unavailable. The realization crashed over him like a wave. The millions he thought he had access to? Gone. The liquidity he needed to salvage this deal? Untouchable. And then, before he could fully process it, his phone buzzed again. Text message. "Brian Lockwood, we need to talk. Now." Brian Lockwood. His lawyer. Jake stared at the screen, his stomach sinking. Brian never texted like that. That wasn't a "let's schedule a meeting" message. That was a "you're in deep sh*T message. He left the hotel bar in a rage. By the time he got to Brian's office, his nerves were frayed, his mind running in 1,000 directions. He stormed in without knocking, slamming the door behind him. "What the hell is going on?" he snapped. Brian didn't even bother pretending to be calm. He shoved a thick manila folder across the desk. Jake flipped it open. And his blood ran cold. Inside were printouts. *TS. Legal filings. A timeline of every single move he had made to cut me out of our assets. But the worst part? The final page. A copy of a formal fraud complaint, stamped with an official IRS case number. Jake swallowed hard. "What is this?" His voice was quieter now, the bravado cracking. Brian folded his hands together. "You tell me." A long silence. "You're being investigated, Jake." "No." He shook his head. "No, that's impossible." Brian exhaled sharply. "Well, the IRS disagrees." Jake ran a hand through his hair, heart hammering. "This is a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong." Brian stared at him. "Do you really expect me to believe that?" Jake clenched his jaw. "This is her," he seethed. "This is Lauren." Brian didn't respond. He didn't need to. Jake shoved back from the desk, pacing. His mind was racing now, trying to find a way out. The money was locked. His biggest investor had pulled out. His property deal was gone. And now, he was looking at a goddamn fraud investigation? This wasn't a setback. This was destruction. He had underestimated me. And now? Now he was drowning. Jake had always considered himself untouchable. He was the kind of man who believed that no matter what went wrong, he'd find a way to land on his feet. But as he sat in Brian's office, gripping the fraud complaint with white-knuckled fingers, the realization finally started to sink in. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't just a setback. This was the end. By the time Jake left the office, his mind was a tangled mess of panic and disbelief. He barely heard Brian's warnings, something about cooperating with the investigation, about keeping his head down, about not making things worse. He needed air. He needed control. So he did what he always did when things weren't going his way. He went home. Except, when he pulled into the driveway, he immediately knew something was wrong. The lights in the house were off. No welcoming glow from the living room, No faint hum of music from the speakers. The place felt empty. He frowned, stepping out of his car, a strange unease creeping up his spine. When he reached for the door handle, he found the locks had been changed. His stomach dropped. He jiggled the handle again. Nothing. Digging into his pocket, he pulled out his keys, trying them one by one, each failure sending another wave of panic through his system. What the hell? Problem, Jake? He froze. Turning slowly, he found me standing on the front steps of the house, arms crossed, a glass of wine in hand. I was calm, too calm, like someone who had already won. He stared at me, his confusion morphing into something darker. You changed the locks, he said, his voice tight. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the moment. I did. His jaw clenched. This is my house. I tilted my head. Funny, that's not what the ownership documents say. The color drained from his face. He knew. He knew. You can't. I can, I cut him off smoothly. And I did. Everything you thought you took from me, I took back and then some. His hands curled into fists. Lauren, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I interrupted, stepping down to his level, my voice steady. I understand that you spent the past year plotting to gut me financially. I understand that you thought I'd roll over and let you take everything. And I understand that you underestimated me. Silence. He swallowed hard. You don't have anywhere to go, do you? I asked, letting the question hang in the air between us. His nostrils flared. I'll get a lawyer. I let out a soft laugh. Oh, Jake, you really should have read the fine print before you started forging signatures and moving money around. His face darkened. What the hell are you talking about? I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to twist the knife. You don't have a dime left to fight me with. He blinked. You froze my assets. I smiled. Did I? You ruined me, he whispered, almost to himself. And for the first time since this all started, I saw something new in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, but fear. Real, genuine fear. He finally understood. He had spent so much time trying to destroy me that he had never stopped to consider what would happen if I fought back. And now it was too late. Leave, I said simply, turning back toward the house. He didn't move. Lauren. I didn't even look at him. You have 5 minutes before I call the police. He hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, his entire body tense, his world crumbling around him. I watched as he sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might snap. And then? He drove away. For the first time in forever, Jake Bennett had nothing. And I had everything. Jake had lost everything. His money? Frozen. His business? In shambles. His reputation? Ruined. But he wasn't done fighting yet. No, men like Jake never accepted defeat. They convinced themselves they could crawl out of any hole, talk their way back into power, manipulate their way back to the top. And that's exactly what he tried to do. 2 days after our last conversation, I got a text from Ashley. Ashley, heads up. He's desperate. Me, how desperate? Ashley, he's trying to set up a meeting with investors. Pitching a recovery plan. I almost laughed. Jake really thought he could salvage this? But fine, let him try. I needed one final blow to finish him off. The morning of his investor meeting, I was already 3 steps ahead. The conference was scheduled at the Mayfield Club, an exclusive networking space for high-level executives, one that Jake used to have access to. He had invited 4 investors, hoping to convince them that everything was under control. That was before I sent each one of them a confidential email. Inside? A breakdown of his financial fraud investigation. The IRS complaint. The real estate deal collapse. And, just for fun, a link to the leaked photos of his affair. Good luck explaining that, Jake. I arrived at the Mayfield Club 15 minutes before the meeting started. Dressed in a sleek, tailored black dress, I walked through the grand lobby, every step deliberate. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclamation. And today, I wasn't just reclaiming my power. I was burying Jake for good. From the second I stepped into the lounge, I spotted him. Sitting at a round mahogany table, a laptop in front of him, nervously checking his watch. The investors hadn't arrived yet, which meant I had perfect timing. I strode straight to his table, watching his expression shift from shock to rage to pure panic. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snapped, rising from his chair. I set my purse down on the table, giving him a slow, amused smile. "Oh, Jake, did you really think you could recover from this?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he growled. "I'll get the money back. I'll rebuild. You think you've won, but..." I reached into my bag and pulled out 4 printed copies of my email. I tossed them onto the table. Jake's eyes flicked down. He barely got through the first few lines before his face drained of color. He swallowed hard. "You sent this to them?" I tilted my head. "Of course I did." His hands shook. "The fraud, the IRS investigation, the bank accounts under review, and the affair? Public knowledge." The door to the lounge opened. Jake flinched. The investors had arrived. For men in custom-tailored suits, their expressions already icy as they scanned the room. Jake turned to them, opening his mouth, desperate to salvage this. "Gentlemen," I greeted smoothly, stepping forward before he could speak. "I assume you received my email?" The tallest of them, Paul Sheridan, nodded stiffly. "We did." His tone was clipped. One of the others folded his arms. "Seems like we've wasted a trip." Jake's hands fisted at his sides. "I can explain." Paul cut him off. "Explain what, Jake? The fraud? The affair? The fact that your business is imploding?" Jake visibly paled. "This is just a misunderstanding," he stammered. "It's not. We're done here." Paul turned on his heel, motioning to the others. Jake lunged forward. "Wait." The second investor, Mark Holloway, gave him a cold stare. "You lied to us, Bennett," he said. Repeatedly. Jake's mouth opened and closed. And then, just like that, they walked out. His last chance at redemption. Gone. He stood there, stunned, his entire body rigid, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I waited a beat, savoring the moment. Then I picked up my purse and turned to leave. Before I stepped away, I glanced back over my shoulder. "By the way," I said, "voice light, your membership to the Mayfield Club? Revoked." His eyes snapped to mine, his expression a horrified mix of rage and disbelief. I smiled. Then I walked out. And Jake? He had nothing left. By the time I left the Mayfield Club, Jake Bennett was finished. His business? Collapsed. His finances? Frozen. His reputation? Shredded beyond repair. And me? I was just getting started. The first thing I did was expand Nova Capital. With Jake out of the picture, I had free rein to move fast. I acquired 2 of his former investment properties at half their value, restructuring them under my name. The very assets he tried to steal from me were now fueling my empire. Ashley called me the next morning, barely able to contain her amusement. "Ashley, you're officially the new shark in the water." Me, good. Ashley, bad news for Jake, though. I smiled. There was no bad news for Jake anymore. Just consequences. With my financial future locked in place, I made my next move. I went public. Not with a scandal. Not with revenge. But with success. I scheduled a press event at one of my new properties, an upscale commercial tower in downtown Chicago. When the media arrived, they weren't expecting me. They were expecting the wife Jake had left behind. Instead, they found a CEO. I stood before a podium, cameras flashing, and announced the rebranding of Nova Capital, a company that would now be one of the city's fastest-growing investment firms. And the best part? Every reporter knew exactly who I was. But none of them mentioned Jake. Because he was irrelevant. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. I had just finished my speech when my assistant, Clara, approached with a smirk. "You're going to love this," she said, handing me her tablet. On the screen? A news article. Former real estate investor Jake Bennett declares bankruptcy amid legal issues. I raised an eyebrow, scrolling through the article. Tax liens. Lawsuits. Debt collectors. He was drowning. He had tried to destroy me, and now he was paying the price. Looks like his investors are suing, Clara added. And the IRS isn't letting up. I let out a soft hum. Good. She grinned. Thought you'd say that. A week later, I got an email from a familiar name. Jake Bennett. The subject line? We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I deleted it without reading a single word. Jake had already taken enough of my time. I had a future to build. And he? He had nothing left but regret. 1 year ago, Jake handed me a betrayal wrapped in arrogance. Today, I stood on the rooftop of Nova Tower, gazing out over the Chicago skyline, a city that was mine now. Jake had tried to erase me. Instead, he had set me free. Nova Capital was now one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the city. Our portfolio had doubled in just 6 months, and our latest high-rise project, the one Jake had tried and failed to secure, was on track to become one of the most profitable developments in the downtown sector. Investors who had once flocked to Jake? They were now lining up to work with me. Former colleagues who had ignored me? Now they wanted meetings, partnerships, opportunities. And Jake? Jake was nowhere. I heard rumors, of course, that he had tried, desperately, to claw his way back into the business world. That every door he knocked on was slammed in his face. That former associates, who once admired him, now barely remembered his name. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose empire had crumbled overnight. And when he finally hit rock bottom, he did what men like him always do. He begged. It started with emails. Then calls. Then, finally, he showed up. I was leaving a meeting when I saw him, standing outside Nova Capital's headquarters. He looked nothing like the man I once knew. The tailored suits? Gone. The cocky smirk? Nowhere to be found. The confidence? Shattered. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Because he had. I stopped a few feet away, waiting for him to speak. His voice was hoarse when he finally said, "Lauren." I raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't be here." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his unruly hair. His jaw tensed. "I need your help." I blinked, then laughed. "You need my help?" His face twisted, but he swallowed whatever pride he had left. "I know I screwed up, okay? But you don't have to let me go down like this." I crossed my arms. "Why not? You had no problem watching me lose everything." His eyes darted away, shame flickering across his face. "That was different," he muttered. I scoffed. "It was different because you thought you'd win." Silence. Then, softly, he admitted, "I never thought you'd fight back." I smiled. "And that was your first mistake." His shoulders slumped. "Lauren, I don't have anywhere else to go." "Not my problem. You should have thought about that before you tried to take everything from me." He flinched. "So that's it? You're just gonna watch me lose everything?" I tilted my head. "Jake," I said, my voice calm. "You lost everything the day you decided I was disposable." And with that, I walked past him, stepping through the glass doors of my building. I didn't look back, because Jake Bennett was already in my past. And I?